Algunos imperialistas se preguntan por qué ayudamos a los angoleños, que qué intereses tenemos nosotros allí. Ellos están acostumbrados a pensar que cuando un país hace algo es porque está buscando petróleo, o cobre, o diamante, o algún recurso natural. No. Nosotros no buscamos ningún interés material y los imperialistas es lógico que no lo entiendan.
Fidel Castro, the longtime revolutionary leader of Cuba, died at 90 on Friday, November 25th. Castro, or Fidel as he was affectionately known by his supporters, was a world-renowned leader who represented internationalism and solidarity with revolutionary movements. Others, though, especially the numerous U.S. presidents who he outlived and the anti-revolutionary Cuban community in exile, despised him. Fidel first burst onto the world stage when, in January 1959, he and his rebel forces overthrew the brutal U.S.-supported dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista after a 3-year guerrilla war. Together with his friend, the Argentinian Ernesto Che Guevara, Castro became an icon of revolutionary movements everywhere during the 1960s. So as to squash the revolutionary inspiration that Castro and the Cuban Revolution represented so close to the U.S. presidents from Eisenhower to George W. Bush launched all manner of efforts to overthrow Castro and, by some counts, over 600 assassination attempts. Originally, Castro did not declare his revolution to be Marxist or communist, but following a failed CIA-organized invasion of Cuba in April 1961, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro reorganized his government and his movement and officially declared it to be socialist. The defeat of the invasion resonated across Latin America and the world, and further raised Castro's standing as the revolutionary who was able to defy U.S. imperialism. In the years that followed, the U.S. kept increasing its economic and political pressure on Cuba, instituting a blockade against all of its exports and imports. As a result, Castro turned toward the USSR and became one of the USSR's main suppliers of sugar. He also gradually reoriented Cuba's economy to follow the Soviet model, installing a planned economy and nationalizing all industries and agricultural production. Throughout his time as leader of revolutionary Cuba, Castro dedicated many resources toward supporting revolutionary movements around the world, particularly in the fight against colonialism. For example, in Africa, he supported national liberation movements in Algeria, Congo, and later in Angola, sending fighters, doctors, and supplies. In Latin America, he supported guerrilla movements that were opposed to U.S.-backed dictatorships in Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. In his internationalism, Castro differed importantly, though, from Soviet policy, which was far more accommodating with the West and pushed its allied communist parties in these countries not to overthrow governments. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba was thrown into a severe economic crisis because it could no longer count on beneficial trade relations with the Soviet Union. Castro had to find new allies, and Cuba began its so-called special period, during which the economy shrank by as much as 40%. Eventually, Castro managed to reorient the economy, though, away from sugar and towards biotechnology and tourism, which by the late 1990s became the main source of foreign income for Cuba. With the 1998 election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Castro acquired a vital new ally and close friend. As a result, Chavez and Castro proceeded to deepen economic and political ties between their two countries. Although Chavez saw in Castro one of his main sources of inspiration, Chavez always spoke of the need to rethink and update socialism for the 21st century, for which he had Castro's full support. One of Cuba's and Venezuela's most important cooperation projects was the area of medicine and oil, whereby Cuba sent tens of thousands of doctors to Venezuela in exchange for subsidized oil. Following a period of illness in 2006, Fidel declared in February 2008 that he would no longer lead the government of Cuba. Cuba's National Assembly thus elected Fidel's brother, Raúl, to the position of president. Fidel continued to write articles and occasionally appeared in public. In one of his last articles, reflecting on President Obama's re-establishment of diplomatic ties between Cuba and the U.S. in late 2014, Fidel said Cuba, quote, has no need for gifts from the empire, end quote. Castro's passing was greeted with statements of appreciation from him from around the world. For example, President José Eduardo dos Santos of Angola said Fidel Castro was a figure, quote, of transcendent historical importance, who left his mark on his era by the role he played in his country and in the great transformation of humanity for the sake of freedom, social justice, and development, end quote. President Evo Morales said Fidel, quote, made so much history not only for Cuba but also for the planet. That is socialism. There will never again be a man or comrade like Fidel, who devoted his life, his knowledge, and his struggle not only to the Cuban people but to all people of the world." Unquote. The Cuban exile community in Florida, especially the older generation though, celebrated Castro's death. And President-elect Donald Trump said, quote, "Today the world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. No head of state, not even the most conservative ones, issued a statement as strongly worded as Trump's." No doubt, Fidel Castro was controversial, especially among the anti-authoritarian left, which criticized the lack of a multi-party political system and the persistence of censorship in Cuba. Castro's defenders, though, would point to the participatory and grassroots democracy that was being developed, particularly in recent years. As for limits placed on freedom of speech, Castro and his defenders argued that this has to be seen in the context of the constant assault of the US against Cuba, which, among other things, spends millions of dollars every year on opposition groups and thus undermines and distorts Cuba's civil society. In the end, though, Castro will probably be remembered above all for his unwavering opposition to imperialism and support for international solidarity with the poor of the world.